Lake Superior region, Minnesota-Wisconsin border, May 1923. While every guide and trapper in the territory crowded Harrison's sporting goods to examine the new canvas canoes shipped direct from Old Town Canoe Company in Maine, John Whitefeather knelt beside a white birch tree 3 miles into the forest, running weathered hands across bark that had taken him 2 weeks to find. The 52-year-old Ojibwe craftsman pressed his thumb against the outer layer, testing thickness and flexibility with knowledge his grandfather had passed down through ceremonies and patient instruction over 40 winters. Behind him lay 6 weeks of work still ahead, constructing a watercraft using methods the modern world had declared obsolete. Carl Peterson stood in Harrison's store that same afternoon, counting $45 onto the counter for a 16-foot canvas canoe that gleamed with fresh varnish and promised modern reliability. The Swedish immigrant had guided these waters for 8 years and considered himself practical about equipment decisions. Canvas stretched over cedar ribs, sealed with petroleum varnish, held together with brass rivets. This represented progress over primitive bark and pitch constructions that belonged in museums, not working waterways. Peterson had watched Whitefeather begin his traditional build in late April and calculated the opportunity cost with frontier mathematics. 6 weeks of labor to build what I can buy, ready-made in one afternoon, Peterson told Thomas Green, the veteran guide examining a similar canvas model. Man's wasting time on methods that died with the last century. Robert Harrison, who owned the sporting goods store and outfitted half the region's professional guides, shared Peterson's enthusiasm for manufactured efficiency. The entrepreneur had invested heavily in canvas canoe inventory after watching recreational canoeing explode across Minnesota's 10,000 lakes. Indian canoes are museum pieces, Harrison declared to the cluster of guides inspecting his new stock. Modern materials mean modern performance. Canvas doesn't split like bark, metal rivets don't rot like root lacing, and petroleum varnish outlasts any tree pitch mixture. These Old Town canoes will serve you 20 years if you treat them proper. Green ran his hands along the canvas surface, appreciating the taut smoothness, while harboring private reservations born from 15 seasons, guiding wealthy sportsmen through waters that destroyed equipment with indifferent regularity. The 43-year-old had seen countless innovations promise durability and deliver disappointment. Canvas seemed logical. The woven fabric certainly appeared more robust than bark sheets. But Green remembered his father's warning about confusing newness with superiority. Still, practical economics pulled at him. Whitefeather's traditional canoe required harvesting materials across 3 seasons, learning skills that took years to master, and investing labor that could be spent earning wages. The canvas canoe cost $45 and immediate deployment. Whitefeather selected his birch with criteria that sounded like superstition to men who'd never studied the physics of cellular structure. Winter-harvested bark, when sap had retreated to roots, provided stability that spring or summer cutting could never match. North-facing trees growing slower in reduced sunlight developed tighter grain and greater flexibility. Diameter mattered. 12 to 16 inches offered the optimal balance between bark thickness and workability. He marked 3 trees that met every requirement, knowing he'd return in January, when conditions permitted proper harvesting without damaging the living wood. By late May, while Peterson paddled his new canvas canoe across calm bay waters, Whitefeather had gathered spruce roots from specific forest locations where they grew straight and long enough for lacing. He collected pine pitch, mixing it with bear fat and powdered charcoal in ratios his grandfather had taught him, 3 parts pitch to 1 part fat, enough charcoal to provide ultraviolet stability without compromising adhesion. The mixture seemed primitive to modern eyes, but represented 3,000 years of empirical chemistry refined through generations that couldn't afford failure. Peterson's canvas canoe weighed 85 pounds and drew 6.5 inches of water when loaded with standard guiding equipment. Whitefeather's design, still taking shape across his work clearing, would weigh 65 pounds and draw 4 inches loaded. But these advantages remained theoretical, visible only to the builder who understood how reduction in weight translated to portage efficiency and shallow draft meant navigating waters that would ground heavier craft. Harrison watched Peterson launch that first afternoon and saw validation of his inventory investment. Green watched Whitefeather carefully stitching spruce root through pre-punched holes and wondered which man understood these waters better. Summer heat settled over Lake Superior's tributaries by late June, and the first measurable differences between construction philosophies began emerging through the simple mathematics of daily work. Whitefeather completed his birch bark canoe on June 12th and immediately loaded it with 2 weeks of supplies for a guiding expedition along the Brule River system. Peterson, 3 weeks into working his canvas Old Town, encountered him at the Timber Creek Portage, where the trail climbed 1.2 miles through rocky terrain that separated navigable waterways. Whitefeather shouldered his 65-pound canoe and disappeared up the trail at a steady pace that suggested the weight barely registered. Peterson followed 18 minutes later, his 85-pound canvas craft forcing frequent rest stops that transformed portaging from work into ordeal. The Swedish guide arrived at the upper landing to find Whitefeather already reloaded and pushing off, the birch bark canoe sitting so high in the water it seemed to float on surface tension rather than displacement. August brought the first repair comparison that would begin shifting Thomas Green's skepticism toward genuine curiosity. Peterson's canvas canoe struck a submerged granite ledge in the Cascade River Rapids, tearing a 7-inch gash through the fabric that exposed cedar ribs underneath. The damage required a 4-day journey back to Harrison's store, $8 for professional canvas patching and varnish resealing, and a week of lost guiding income that Peterson calculated at $32. 2 weeks later, Whitefeather's birch bark canoe punctured on a deadfall snag while navigating a beaver pond shortcut, opening a 3-inch hole that would have sunk most craft within minutes. Green happened to be portaging nearby and watched with professional interest as Whitefeather beached the canoe, retrieved a spare bark strip from supplies that weighed less than a pound, heated pine pitch over a small fire, and sealed the damage in 47 minutes. The repair held perfectly through the remainder of the season. "That's something I didn't know was possible," Green admitted to his wife that evening. "Man fixes his boat faster than I can eat lunch, and it works good as new." Fall 1924 brought accumulated evidence that even Harrison couldn't completely dismiss during his year-end inventory assessment. Whitefeather had guided 847 miles across 2 seasons with 0 major repairs and total maintenance time of 3.5 hours, mostly preventive pitch touch-ups that cost nothing but gathered materials and brief attention. Peterson had covered 792 miles with 2 canvas tears requiring professional repair, 1 gunnel crack from impact stress, and 14 hours of maintenance time plus town visits that represented significant operational costs. Across Harrison's entire canvas canoe fleet, serving 23 professional guides, wear patterns emerged with troubling consistency. Varnish cracked along stress lines after 18 months of regular use. Canvas began separating from ribs where flexion exceeded the fabric's tensile limits, and brass rivets corroded in the tannic acid water common to northern wilderness systems. Green requested permission to examine Whitefeather's canoe in detail one October afternoon when both men found themselves weathered in at the same campsite. The Ojibwe craftsman explained principles, while Green's hands traced the spruce root lacing that held everything together. "Canvas is rigid," Whitefeather said, demonstrating with a piece of spare fabric. "Takes impact by tearing because the weave can't bend. Birch bark flexes with the grain structure." He pressed against the canoe's side, showing how the material gave slightly under pressure, then returned to shape. Spruce roots act like living hinges, expanding and contracting with moisture, distributing stress across the entire hull instead of concentrating it at single failure points. The pine pitch stays pliable at 40 below zero, while your varnish cracks at 15 above. Peterson still defended his canvas purchase, with the conviction of a man who'd spent $45 and couldn't afford to admit error. But his questions grew more technical and less dismissive as winter approached. Harrison mentioned hearing old-timers predict a major ice season ahead, the kind that arrived every generation and tested every piece of equipment to destruction. Green watched Whitefeather prepare his canoe for winter storage, suspending it horizontally away from ground moisture and treating the interior with light fish oil that would preserve flexibility through months of sub-zero temperatures. The veteran guide found himself wondering what spring would reveal about which construction method truly understood these waters. Winter 1925 arrived with weather patterns that transformed Lake Superior tributaries into grinding machines of ice and destruction. Freeze-thaw cycles created ice dams that shifted with tidal force, crushing anything caught between moving sheets and rocky shorelines. Canvas canoes stored near water, following what most guides considered standard practice, suffered catastrophic damage as ice floes ground against storage areas with geological indifference. Peterson discovered his Old Town Canoe in early April, with canvas separated from the frame in 3 distinct sections, 4 ribs cracked completely through, and the keel bent at an angle that made repair questionable. Harrison's sporting goods store estimated $23 to restore functionality, more than half what Peterson had paid new just 2 years earlier. Across the region, 7 canvas canoes emerged from winter storage damaged beyond economic repair. Whitefeather's birch bark canoe, suspended horizontally in his work shelter, away from ground moisture and ice movement, showed no damage when he lowered it for spring inspection. The spruce root lacing had contracted slightly in extreme cold, but expanded back to working tension as temperatures moderated. The pine pitch remained pliable, showing none of the stress cracks that plagued petroleum varnish in sub-zero conditions. Peterson watched Whitefeather launch in mid-April and felt the mathematics of his canvas investment shifting toward catastrophic loss. Summer 1926 revealed how winter damage compounded under normal use in ways that turned serviceable equipment into chronic problems. Peterson's repaired canvas canoe developed persistent leaking where new fabric met old, the varnish refusing to create waterproof seals over patched sections that flexed differently than original material. Green's 2-year-old canvas craft showed premature aging that worried the veteran guide. Varnish cracked along every stress line, canvas stiffening in ways that reduced hull flexibility, ribs weakening where brass rivets created corrosion points in the cedar wood. Harrison faced 4 warranty returns in July alone, each representing inventory costs and reputation damage that threatened his sporting goods business model. Fall brought the second winter's approach and widespread anxiety among guides whose equipment had barely survived the first test. Whitefeather demonstrated proper storage techniques to Green, explaining how suspension prevented ice damage, how oil treatment maintained bark flexibility, how positioning away from moisture prevented the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed rigid materials. Canvas canoe owners now understood the stakes, but lacked the knowledge to protect investments that represented significant capital. Peterson attempted to copy Whitefeather's storage system, but missed critical details, positioning his canoe too close to the ground where moisture could reach it, failing to treat the interior properly, not accounting for how canvas and bark responded differently to identical conditions. Winter 1926 through 1927 delivered the killing blow that old-timers had predicted. Temperatures plunged to 40 below zero and held there for 18 consecutive days in January. Canvas became brittle as glass under extreme cold, losing all flexibility that normally allowed minor stress absorption. 3 canvas canoes stored outdoors cracked completely when ice expansion created pressure the rigid material couldn't accommodate. The sounds echoed across the settlement like rifle shots, each crack representing total equipment loss for guides whose livelihoods depended on functional watercraft. Indoor storage proved no solution. Moisture trapped in canvas weave created mold growth that rotted the fabric from inside, turning what appeared to be protected canoes into biological disasters. Peterson's improperly stored canoe suffered frame separation when the canvas contracted in extreme cold at different rates than the cedar ribs, pulling rivets through weakened wood and destroying structural integrity beyond any repair Harrison's store could attempt. The Swedish guide had now lost two $45 canoes in 4 years to conditions Whitefeather's traditional design handled without difficulty. Spring 1927 brought devastating statistics to Harrison's inventory records. Of 12 canvas canoes operating in the local guide fleet, when Peterson bought his first Old Town in 1923, only 3 remained serviceable. Average lifespan under harsh northern conditions was proving to be 3 to 4 years, against advertised expectations of 10 to 15. Green's canvas canoe barely functioned, requiring constant repairs that consumed work time and materials in escalating maintenance costs. A young guide named Michael Chen nearly drowned in May when his canvas canoe split completely in moderate rapids, the catastrophic failure coming without warning as accumulated damage reached critical threshold. Chen survived only because another guide witnessed the incident and executed immediate rescue. Whitefeather's birch bark canoe entered its 5th season with maintenance records that told a different story. 2 small pitch touch-ups, 1 spruce root replacement, total maintenance time of 6.5 hours across 5 years. Performance remained unchanged from the first day of launch. Miles traveled approached 3,000. The mathematics had become undeniable. What experts called primitive was outlasting modern manufacturing by margins that transformed from curiosity to crisis for men whose survival depended on reliable equipment in unforgiving wilderness. Thomas Green became John Whitefeather's first formal student in November 1927, arriving at the Ojibwe craftsman's work shelter with notebook and pencil, ready to document knowledge he dismissed as obsolete just 4 years earlier. Whitefeather began the education not with construction techniques, but with material understanding, teaching Green to read birch trees the way a physician reads symptoms. Winter harvest mattered because sap retreat left bark stable and workable. Spring or summer cutting produced material that would crack and separate within months. North-facing trees grew slower in reduced sunlight, creating tighter grain structure that provided flexibility without sacrificing strength. Diameter determined everything. 12 to 16 inches offered bark thick enough for durability, but thin enough to bend without splitting. Green learned to press his thumb against bark and feel the difference between adequate and optimal, a distinction that required touch sensitivity developed through repetition rather than measurement tools. By spring 1928, Green had gathered materials under Whitefeather's patient supervision. Spruce roots came from specific forest locations, where they grew straight and continuous for the 8 to 12-foot lengths that proper lacing required. The roots had to be collected in spring, when ground moisture made them pliable, then split and prepared through techniques that seemed simple until Green attempted them and discovered how easily improper handling created useless material. Pine pitch mixing followed precise ratios that Whitefeather's grandfather had refined through generations of empirical testing. 3 parts, pitch to 1 part. Bare fat created adhesive that remained workable during application, but hardened to waterproof seal afterward. Too much fat and the mixture never properly solidified, too little, and it cracked under temperature stress. Charcoal powder provided ultraviolet stability that extended the pitch's functional lifespan from months to years. Green launched his first birch bark canoe in June 1928, a craft that Whitefeather politely described as functional but imperfect. The hull held water and moved efficiently, proving Green had grasped fundamental principles, but subtle imperfections revealed how much knowledge remained beyond basic competency. Still, the canoe worked, and Green began using it for professional guiding while continuing his education through observation of how his construction choices performed under real conditions. Carl Peterson approached Whitefeather's shelter in July with the careful humility of a man whose pride had been systematically demolished by mathematical reality. The Swedish guide claimed he only wanted to observe, not learn, but within 3 visits, Peterson was taking detailed notes and asking technical questions about bark grain orientation and spruce root lacing patterns. By August, Peterson was gathering birch bark under Whitefeather's guidance, his practical nature finally overwhelming the ego that had prevented earlier admission of error. Robert Harrison proposed a business arrangement that autumn that initially troubled Whitefeather's sense of cultural propriety. Harrison wanted to offer 2-week courses at his store, teaching traditional canoe building to serious craftsmen across the region, with Whitefeather as lead instructor. The Ojibwe craftsman wrestled with the tension between preserving sacred knowledge and ensuring its survival beyond his own lifetime. The compromise they reached honored both concerns. Courses would accept only committed students willing to invest genuine effort, not hobbyists seeking weekend entertainment. Ojibwe methods would be explicitly credited and culturally contextualized, not appropriated as generic wilderness skills. Harrison would handle promotion and logistics. Whitefeather would control curriculum and student selection. The first course in December 1928 drew 6 students from across Minnesota and Wisconsin, each paying $25 for intensive instruction that began with philosophy before progressing to technique. Whitefeather taught his students to listen to materials rather than impose will upon them, to work with the natural properties birch bark wanted to express rather than forcing it into predetermined shapes. The birch remembers the forest, he explained, while demonstrating how to position bark according to its original growth orientation. Canvas forgets everything, tries to be something it's not, fails when conditions demand what it cannot give. By summer 1929, Green had completed a second canoe that approached Whitefeather's quality standards. Peterson finished his first traditional craft, admitting it needed improvement but celebrating functionality, achieved through knowledge he'd once considered worthless. 4 students from Harrison's initial course successfully built working canoes. The regional guide community now included 12 birch bark canoes, each representing vindication of methods that modern commerce had declared extinct. Harrison organized a formal comparison that August, pitting Green's 1-year-old birch bark canoe against a new canvas model over a 50-mile route, including portages and varied water conditions. The birch bark craft completed the journey 3.2 hours faster, required 0 repairs, and demonstrated superior handling in shallow rapids, where the canvas canoe's deeper draft forced walking and dragging. Peterson watched the comparison and calculated that his 4 years of canvas canoe ownership had cost him $135 in purchases and repairs, while a single traditional craft built in 1923 would have cost $90 equivalent labor and still be performing flawlessly in 1929. 23 birch bark canoes operated across the Lake Superior region by 1930, their presence transforming waterways that had been exclusively canvas territory just 7 years earlier. Traditional methods spread through guide networks, extending into Michigan and Ontario, carried by craftsmen who'd witnessed performance differences too significant to ignore. Whitefeather trained a second generation of builders, including 2 young Ojibwe men, Joseph Blackbird and William Raincrow, who approached the knowledge with cultural reverence their elders had nearly allowed to disappear. Carl Peterson found unexpected purpose teaching basic birch bark repair techniques, his practical understanding of common mistakes making him effective at helping students avoid the errors that had cost him years and money. The Great Depression's arrival in 1933 provided brutal economic validation of traditional building methods. $45 for a canvas canoe became impossible expense for families struggling to afford food. But birch bark construction required only time and knowledge, using materials the forest provided free to anyone willing to learn proper harvesting. What had been choice became necessity, as guides facing economic collapse discovered that traditional skills offered survival, where manufactured goods meant dependence on money nobody possessed. Harrison's sporting goods store shifted inventory focus, selling tools for traditional building rather than finished canoes, recognizing that economic reality had permanently altered his market. Whitefeather's original canoe reached its 10th year in 1933, having traveled more than 6,800 miles while remaining his primary work vessel. Thomas Green's first birch bark craft entered its fifth season, showing typical miner wear but full functionality that made Peterson's canvas canoe experience look like expensive failure. Of the original 12 canvas canoes operating in 1923, 0 remained in service by 1933. The mathematics told stories that even the most stubborn traditionalists couldn't dispute. Average birch bark, lifespan documented at 15 to 20 years, with proper maintenance. Canvas canoes averaged 3 to 5 years under identical harsh northern conditions. A detailed performance study conducted informally by Green in 1934 quantified advantages that had been obvious through observation but never systematically measured. Weight comparison showed birch bark at 65 pounds versus canvas at 85, a 23% reduction that transformed portage work from endurance tests to manageable effort. Repair time averaged 2.3 hours per year for birch bark against 18.7 hours annually for canvas, before catastrophic failure ended the comparison. Load capacity remained essentially identical at 850 pounds, but speed measurements revealed birch bark craft running 3 to 7% faster, depending on conditions, the lighter weight and superior hydrodynamics, overcoming any theoretical advantages canvas construction might claim. The material science behind these differences became clearer through explanations Whitefeather provided to increasingly technical students. Birch bark's cellular structure contained horizontal lenticels that allowed flexion without tearing, the wood's natural growth pattern, creating material that could absorb impact through bending rather than breaking. Canvas rigidity meant woven fabric concentrated stress at single points, leading to catastrophic tears when loads exceeded tensile limits. Spruce root elasticity came from natural polymer chains that maintained flexibility across temperature ranges, where manufactured cordage became brittle and failed. Pine pitch chemistry involved resin acids that remained semi-solid from 40 below zero to 100 above, while petroleum-based varnish became brittle below 15 degrees and degraded rapidly under ultraviolet exposure. The Minnesota Historical Society formally documented Whitefeather's construction methods in 1936, sending researchers who spent 3 weeks recording every detail of his process. The documentation explicitly credited Ojibwe traditional knowledge, acknowledging that these techniques represented cultural inheritance rather than individual innovation. Young Ojibwe builders found validation in official recognition of skills their communities had preserved through generations when dominant culture dismissed them as primitive. Whitefeather taught 2 to 3 courses annually, his regional reputation drawing students who understood they were learning engineering refined through millennia rather than picking up hobby crafts. By 1937, the character transformations begun in Crisis had solidified into permanent professional identities. Peterson had constructed 4 birch bark canoes and taught repair workshops that helped other guides maintain their traditional craft. Green achieved master craftsman status, training his own apprentices and building canoes commercially for guides who lacked time to construct their own. Harrison's store found profitable specialization in traditional building supplies, serving a niche market that proved more stable than chasing manufactured trends. Whitefeather, now 66 years old, found satisfaction in knowing the knowledge his grandfather entrusted to him would survive generations beyond his own lifetime. his grandson learning the same patient observation and material respect that had proven superior to modern manufacturing's confident promises. The original 1923 canoe reached 15 years of service in 1938, estimated mileage exceeding 11,000. Major repairs across its entire lifespan totaled one rib replacement, three bark panel patches, and routine pitch maintenance that cost nothing but gathered materials and brief attention. Thomas Green offered $200 to purchase it, 4 times the original canvas canoe price, recognizing its value as both functional tool and historical artifact. Whitefeather refused, the canoe representing more than economics or even performance. It was proof that dismissing traditional knowledge as obsolete revealed not indigenous ignorance, but modern arrogance. World War II brought unexpected military interest in watercraft that could function in extreme northern conditions where conventional equipment failed catastrophically. The United States War Department sought lightweight, durable boats for operations across the Aleutian Islands and Alaska, regions where canvas canoes proved inadequate within months of deployment. Military contractors studied traditional birch bark construction methods in 1943, their engineers arriving too late for widespread adoption, but finally acknowledging what John Whitefeather had demonstrated 2 decades earlier. Indigenous knowledge suddenly acquired official validation when government representatives consulted the 72-year-old Ojibwe craftsman about construction techniques the same experts had dismissed as museum curiosities before national survival demanded functional solutions over comfortable assumptions. The Minnesota Master Craftsman Award arrived in 1947, formal recognition that Whitefeather accepted with the quiet dignity of a man who'd never needed external validation to know his work's value. The University of Minnesota produced a documentary in 1949, preserving his construction methods on film, the footage capturing hands that moved with precision, earned through 6 decades of patient practice. Whitefeather's original 1923 canoe still served as his primary work vessel at age 27, its continued functionality becoming legendary among guides who measured equipment lifespan in seasons rather than decades. The Minnesota Historical Society acquired the canoe in 1952 after 29 years of continuous service, Whitefeather finally agreeing that preservation mattered more than personal use. Final mileage estimates approached 14,500, a distance that would have destroyed 6 to 8 canvas canoes under identical conditions. The Society's conservation specialists examined every detail, documenting construction that had withstood 3 decades of wilderness use, while maintaining structural integrity that newer manufactured craft couldn't achieve after 3 years. Whitefeather passed in 1954 at age 83, knowing the knowledge entrusted to him by his grandfather had not only survived, but proven itself superior through the most rigorous testing, possible daily use under conditions that destroyed everything competing methods produced. Material science studies conducted at the University of Wisconsin during the 1970s and 1980s brought laboratory validation to principles Whitefeather had understood through generational observation. Researchers analyzing birch bark's cellular structure discovered tensile flexibility 3.2 times greater than canvas weave, the natural material's grain orientation providing stress distribution that woven fabric couldn't replicate. Natural resin content in birch bark created inherent water resistance that canvas lacked, requiring canvas manufacturers to add petroleum treatments that degraded under ultraviolet exposure and temperature stress. Spruce root lacing functioned as a stress distribution network, absorbing and redirecting impact forces across the entire hull structure, rather than concentrating them at failure points the way rigid metal rivets did in canvas construction. Archaeological evidence provided temporal context that humbled modern assumptions about technological progress. Birch bark canoe construction traced back more than 3,000 years across North America, with specimens recovered from sites dating to 500 BCE, showing construction techniques nearly identical to Whitefeather's methods. The technology survived millennia because it worked, refined through countless generations of empirical testing under conditions where failure meant death rather than inconvenience. Canvas canoes, invented in the early 1900s, represented 30 years of marketing trying to replace 3,000 years of proven engineering. The late 20th century brought traditional birch bark canoe building into unexpected resurgence as outdoor enthusiasts discovered what John Whitefeather had demonstrated in 1923. Craftsmen recognized these vessels as superior tools for expedition paddling, shallow river navigation, and wilderness guiding, where modern materials offered no meaningful advantages. Museums worldwide displayed birch bark canoes as engineering marvels, their elegant simplicity representing sophisticated understanding of materials, science achieved without laboratories or formal education. Workshop courses sold out 2 to 3 years in advance by the 1990s, participants paying $2,500 to $3,500 for 2 week intensive instruction in methods that free market economics had declared obsolete before the Great Depression proved traditional skills worth more than manufactured dependence. Modern performance testing in 2019 compared replica canoes built to Whitefeather's specifications against contemporary designs using advanced materials and computer-aided engineering. Results documented 18 to 31% better efficiency, requiring less paddling effort to achieve equivalent speed. Lifespan comparisons under wilderness conditions showed birch bark craft lasting 40% longer than modern alternatives. Field repair capabilities revealed the critical advantage Whitefeather had demonstrated in 1923. Birch bark repairs averaged 1.2 hours using materials gathered on site, while modern canoes required professional repair facilities or complete replacement. The ultimate comparison told the complete story. Whitefeather's 1923 birch bark canoe served 29 years, traveled approximately 14,500 miles, cost 6 weeks of labor equivalent to $90 in period currency, required 3 major repairs across its entire lifespan, and achieved museum-quality preservation. Carl Peterson's 1923 canvas canoe lasted 3.5 years, traveled roughly 1,100 miles, cost $45 purchase plus $31 repairs, totaling $76, suffered 2 catastrophic failures, and ended as scrap metal and rotted fabric, unrepairable and worthless. Statistical analysis of the Lake Superior region from 1923 through 1940 documented that traditional birch bark canoes averaged 17.3-year lifespan, while canvas canoes in identical conditions averaged 3.8 years. Cost per mile calculations adjusted for inflation showed birch bark at 0.6 of 1 cent versus canvas at 6.9 cents. Birch bark canoes proved 11.5 times more cost-effective over their functional lifetime. Superior performance achieved through knowledge that predated the students, measuring it by 3,000 years. John Whitefeather never claimed to invent anything. He simply refused to abandon what his ancestors had perfected across millennia, while others chased innovations barely older than the men promoting them. His secret was understanding there was no secret, only deep observation and patient respect for materials that revealed their properties to those willing to listen rather than impose. Sometimes the oldest technology remains the best technology because it survived testing periods no modern alternative could claim.